Angel, this is like you've been here a few days now,
Yeah.
yeah? And this is your second time in Hong Kong. How are you
Yes.
feeling?
I'm feeling great. I love it. You know, the jet lag thing is it's quite active.
Yeah.
I thought after 3 days, I'm like, I got this, but still settling it. But overall, it's been great. Just meeting some new friends and eating some amazing food.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna stay a couple extra days,
Yeah.
so I'm looking forward to that.
Check out the beaches.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And speaking of beaches, so as Elaine was saying, you're someone who is coming to us from Puerto Rico, and it's also where you grew up. And I was wondering if you could talk a little about, because I think one of the things that, Hauser Wirth in presenting the exhibition, they said, oh, well, there's, commonalities between Hong Kong and Puerto Rico. But I'm not sure that the audiences here are necessarily so familiar. And I was wondering if you could say a little about what it was like growing up in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, so I'm born and raised in the island of Puerto Rico. I left the island around the age of 23. Growing up pretty much in a middle class, working class family was beautiful. I think over time I have learned to, as I have mature, I have learned to appreciate it even more and also just see think about many details and memories of being there. My dad worked as an insurance agent. My mom worked at a bank, and they were quite working a lot. So I was mostly raised by my grandmother. The first house that I grew up was a house in front of the ocean.
Yeah.
So I don't know if necessarily because of that reason, but always been very attached to just what the ocean can represent in general in many different ways.
Yeah.
And as you can see, the idea of water has been present on this show. Then later, my mom moved to another town further from the beach, more kind of metropolis, and she built a little house for my grandma and me on top, which
Oh.
is something quite common. And there I finished high school. I went to the University of Puerto Rico to study art.
Yeah.
I tried to graduate there. I didn't have the chance. I studied for like 4 years and then I dropped out because my dad strongly pushed me to become an insurance agent as
Yeah.
well. And I became one. I wasn't the best salesperson ever. I always made art since a young age. I always was a very creative young kid with a lot of curiosity of what art was about.
Yeah.
And so at that stage, I got approached by the School of the Arts of Chicago
Yeah.
to if I wanted to retake my BFA
Yeah.
with them, and I did. I moved to Chicago in 2003.
And so that's kind of, like the kind of the leading up. And let's see. Oh, is this? Oh,
There you go.
okay, there we go. So this, so we're surrounded by your exhibition here, but I thought it could be also nice to see some of the.
Was there an image before that one?
There was, but I moved it.
Oh, you moved it. Okay,
I moved
sorry.
it. Yeah.
Sorry.
So, I thought we could also look at some of the paintings that were at because this is your second show with Hauser and Wirth.
Yes.
And the first one was in New York last year. And these are some of the work that was on view there. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that, in the more figurative work that you can see in the slides, but also in the exhibition here,
Yeah.
there's, people may not realize it, but some of the elements that, of the furniture, for instance, or you were talking about the water itself kind of like being reminiscent of the ocean, right?
Yes.
And kind of Puerto Rico. I was wondering if you could talk a little about the meaning of these objects that are in your paintings.
Yeah, I have at I think at a certain stage as a student in Chicago and my master's degree, I started really embracing memory and memory as even more specifically kind of jumping into particular objects that I grew up around.
Yeah.
Within the house. These included from the sofa to chairs
Yeah.
to the tiles, the gates of my house. I was trying to kind of insert myself in the house more as this very poetic and environment that highlighted not just the things that I grew up around with, but kind of questioning more my relationships to them in terms of like how they also can juxtapose um, even my emotions towards my family,
Yeah.
right? And growing up in Puerto Rico in a specific kind of middle class, so I have always, embedded them in the paintings, and most of the figurative paintings, and we'll jump into the abstract once in a little while, but they some of these objects sparked the idea, started the works, and they slowly start evolving as I come every day in the studio revisiting the work, thinking about other kind of objects and things that I can put together
Yeah.
to not tell a story per se, but kind of open a window of a very ambiguous narrative
Yeah.
that can become not just a story about myself or biographical, but something more universal.
Yeah. Yeah, so like for instance, in this one, we
Mm-hmm.
have like the piano, which is in your upstate New York studio,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, for example, that's an example of me bringing
Uh-huh.
not necessarily objects
Or
of
this one too,
my
right?
past. Yes.
Yeah.
Not objects of my past, but also objects of my present,
Yeah.
and collapsing them with elements of my past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the floor here is something that is very reminiscent of Puerto Rico.
The floor
like the
is a
tile.
very popular. They call it a Creole tile,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very popular in Puerto Rico in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. But
Yeah.
obviously, it's a connection towards the colonial element of the island by the Spanish.
Yeah.
So it comes from that kind of tradition of the Sevilla type of tile.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then so some of it is very kind of, like Puerto Rico, like more generally, but some of it is also very specific to your growing up and your household, like
Yes.
your home. Um, and one of the things is like, for instance, I was really taken by, the stories that you told about your grandmother, for instance.
Yeah.
And, like one of the things that I think people think about, or your work has been described as being magical realist, in some ways, but there's also an element of autobiography in some of the things. So like, I thought it was amazing that you told the story once of the why is the chair in the bathtub? And it's like, some people are like, oh, it's because it's magical realism. And then I was wondering if you could share with the audience here, like,
the real story is that I grew up with a chair in the bathtub of my grandmother's house because my great grandmother was also present in the house.
Yeah.
But she was handicapped, so she needed to get bathed by my grandma.
Yeah.
So the tub always had a chair and other kind of objects, and I think the oddness of growing up around that, and obviously as a kid you compare it to your friends' houses and things like that.
Yeah.
I find it, not just biographical in terms of the narrative, but I think again, open up the possibility of magical realism, but also is all very metaphoric, very poetic, almost humoristic to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah. So like the objects they're there, but they're not like the main subject per se. They're like a starting point.
Yes, correct. Yeah, they do, and then I start kind of building out of that, elements. For example, the painting that you see on the right, which I have a tendency to use a lot of chairs in the paintings.
Yeah.
The last element that I added was that I felt composition-wise, this is thinking more about formal aspects of painting.
Yeah.
Was that, okay, I have this angle with this blue and I have these tiles also on an angle. Like I needed something to break all these angles in this painting.
Yeah.
So I wanted something with white. And I had drawn this idea of this white curtain on it. And then I thought it looked like toilet paper. And I thought it was cool because it was around the pandemic.
Yeah.
And there was a moment at least in the United States, that there was a big issue with toilet paper.
Oh yeah, that's
so
true.
So I thought it was really cool.
Uh-huh. Yeah. That's really funny. Yeah. And then so this is the painting, with the pink water and the blue shower curtain. And there's one downstairs too.
There's one downstairs. Yeah.
And then here's the chair. And then we get to this one. Can you say a little more about this?
Yeah, this painting, I will say, is one of the most iconic for me personally works, and very important to me, because this is a work I did as a grad student in Chicago. In a moment that I realized that I did not know how to speak about my work.
Yeah.
Because I was making abstract work paintings. I thought abstraction was about only the emotional element. And through certain conversations with other professors, I realized that I needed to paint something that I needed to speak about, you know.
Yeah.
So I really took upon that challenge. And also I always thought I didn't paint it that well figuratively.
Yeah.
So I was always kind of running away from the figurative painting. So I jumped into this subject. I wrote some memories, and the one that really extended out was the idea of the dining table in my house,
Yeah.
which was always crowded with games, flowers, food, etc.
Uh-huh.
So what I knew is that I wanted to paint something that was very me. So I took upon that memory, but at the same time, I needed to paint something that wasn't traditionally painted because I wanted to balance kind of the content and the formal aspects of the painting in some manner. I didn't want the content to be more important than the way I painted,
Yeah.
or the way I painted to be more important than the content.
Yeah.
So as I was kind of, making this work, I had a lot of stuff in my studio that I was kind of exploring and using on paintings, collages. So the green are cutouts from paintings, small paintings that I didn't like.
Yeah.
This is oil paint that is applied in a more thick kind of way. Do you have a piece of the pattern? The white and red checker is paper collage, and then I paint on top of that, and then this is just fully painted. But then the one moment was that when I wanted to recreate the flowers, I had in my palette this accumulation of dry oil paint that I have never had the guts to throw out because it's quite expensive. So I just kept it and kept it and kept it. And at some moment, very impulsively, I thought they looked like dirt or dead flowers. So I just quickly grabbed this material and started collaging it on the canvas.
The dry oil
The
paint
dry oil paint.
that you like scraped from somewhere else.
Exactly. So the first one came from my just paintings that I scraped
Yeah.
when I was cleaning my palette in the studio. So I took that dry oil paint, I started collaging it. And I like that the painting started also taking a very three-dimensional kind of form to it. That's why you have the white space, just to make it more theatrical. It's about this object, it's not about the space.
Yeah.
And so this painting brought me some great amount of feedback from my professors.
Yeah.
And then later ended up in some great shows. But the thing that really sparked the most was the fact of this dry oil paint that I collaged. So I wanted to repeat it on new paintings.
Yeah.
So when I ran out from my material, I'm like, well, I want it to be oil paint because it's such a historical medium and so complex.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I needed to dry quick, which is difficult. So I started painting little sheets of glass in the studio with different colors, letting it dry, take my scraper or my palette knife and kind of scrape that out and reuse it.
Yeah.
And there was a day that I came back to scrape these new colors that I painted on glasses that were already stained with colors.
Yeah.
So when I scraped the new layers of the paint, I know there was a print of the stains of previous color in the paint.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a aha moment. And I remember being on the floor and saying like, wow, this is really interesting because I can paint over glass, either figurative or abstract or whatever I feel like painting.
Yeah.
And then I can kind of keep painting these layers. And then I can scrape that off the glass. And I'm going to reveal a distorted paint / print.
Yeah.
Oh, but it's three-dimensional. Yeah. But it's a decollage and it's a collage. So I thought I was just covering all these different ways of making art, but keeping painting as a nucleus, right?
Yeah.
Which is what I really intended to. Yeah. So I took upon the voyage, I guess, of finding a way of making this in what I like, which is more monumental type of painting.
Yeah. So can we back up because okay, so now we're kind of getting into like your work, your working process. But like when you left Puerto Rico, this was not something that you had like developed yet.
Correct.
And from what I understand, the training you received in Puerto Rico was very like conservative. Like it was not
very
at
conservative.
all.
Yeah, very conservative. Mostly oriented in the island and the artists of the island, which were very relevant as well. But in terms of more of a contemporary sense, I felt I didn't have the challenge.
Yeah.
So like I said earlier, I dropped out of school.
Yeah.
Became that insurance agent thing.
Yeah.
And And sometime not far later, a professor of mine
Uh-huh.
sent or gave a call to the admission program in Chicago.
Yeah.
And it said that he had a student very talented that he wanted them to approach me, which they did.
Yeah.
And months later, they were, by coincidence, they were in Puerto Rico and they interviewed me. And that's how I ended up in Chicago.
Yeah. And you arrive in Chicago, and there's an anecdote you tell about, like your professor is asking you, like, who's your favorite artist, or who's the artist that you.
Yeah, it was the first day of school, and
Uh-huh.
very normal. Like, everybody say your name, say
Yeah.
your favorite contemporary artist.
Yeah.
I thought I understood what contemporary meant in art, but when it was my turn, I'm like, oh, I'm Angel Otero. I'm from Puerto Rico, and my favorite contemporary artist is Jackson Pollock.
Yeah.
And everybody started laughing, and I'm getting very, what's it called, red. And I still didn't understand why everybody was making fun of me.
Yeah.
And then a girl later on, who I asked, she said, well, they were asking of contemporary artists, and you said an artist from the 50s.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right, because the professor, kind of put his arm around me. He's like, how does it feel to live in the 50s, my friend? And, it was embarrassing, of course, but it put me in a position where I had to realize that I'm about to enter a program
Yeah.
in a moment in art in general where what is it that I'm going to bring, what is this, what is it that is around me in the present? And so I started questioning and kind of exploring more of a contemporary sense of artists that I've never heard before in the island. And this is a time where, yes, of course, there's internet, but it wasn't as quick as researching a name. I had to go to the library and blah, blah. And so it put me in a nice position as a student back then.
Yeah. And then, so you start learning, you start catching up really fast, right, in Chicago. And I think, for people who maybe, are familiar with artists in Chicago, there's like a few that, like more recently have become well known, like Harry James Marshall, or, like Theaster Gates, who you're a contemporary of, right? But like when you were at the art school of the Art Institute of Chicago, who were you looking at? What were the things that you felt like were like, oh yeah, I gotta
Well, I always heard of the images, right? This was the local artist that Chicago was always very proud.
Yeah.
I couldn't say I was quickly inspired by them, right? Because at the moment I was so, just researching more and more abstract painting and the abstract way of painting. And so, but I would say the one thing that really influenced me a lot was the fact that I needed to walk through the museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, between my classes.
Yeah.
And I came across a lot this painting by William de Kooning called Excavation. And later on, I studied a lot about it. But just being so close to so many incredible paintings at the Art Institute that I had the opportunity to visit right in person, really, I don't know, it just gave me this sense of maintaining a challenge to myself, of questioning.
Yeah.
And so I think for overall, that was the most inspiring thing.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think one of the things that I have been thinking, about your work was also like, on the one hand, there's this very strong component of memory and thinking about the past and wanting to, keep the past with you, right? Like whether it's your family or, as we'll see in a little bit, like, art history.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I feel like, like when you said de Kooning, Pollock was your favorite artist, when you first started school. I mean, that revealed like, I think maybe like your ambition to really want to do something like very innovative, right? And very radical.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that, I think in the work that you're doing, there's elements of both. You can see the memory and the history, but then kind of in the painting, like wanting to do something that is like that's, your contribution to painting as a practice, right? Yeah. And working with images so that, this is your father, you said.
That's a photo of my father as a kid, yes.
And but then you're kind of like.
Then I will convert it into this sort of horizontal lines because I thought it will be a strong reference to old etchings, right?
Yeah.
So I will project that into paper or canvas, and then kind of with a coke gun, just every line just kind of drew over with silicone.
Yeah.
So silicone. So I create my own plate. for making the print. So then I will bring, as the silicone will be dry, I will bring that down to the floor and throw, if you want to show the next picture, I would throw then graphite and then take the canvas and just do an imprint or monotype of this material.
Yeah.
So obviously what it does, it distorts the imagery to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think that my I guess psychological element of doing this process wasn't not only because of the trying to find a unique language, right?
Yeah.
Which is true what you said. That was something that hit me looking at books and knowing that you can say, oh, that's Picasso, oh, that's Pollock, oh, that's this, that's that.
Yeah.
Like how do we enter our originality making art without necessarily sitting back and like, what can I do that no artists have done, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Which I feel is almost impossible. But on top of that, the process really is kind of this very psychological element of how I personally perceive memory, how I think about my past, how I think about my roots, my emotional reaction to where I grew up.
Yeah.
This is the house of my mom, and my grandma and I will live upstairs. So objects like the gates in this balcony, which is something in a place where I played a lot, I have used it in the works. These were my first attempt to sculpture. I recreated the gates of the house, and I decided that I wanted to mix it with clay and fired it on the kiln,
Yeah.
which was not an easy task. So I had to buy my own kiln to do all this, you know, insanity. And I will fire them all separately and then re-weld it in this sort of, like you say, looks like destroyed, but you know, I don't like calling it destroyed.
Yeah.
But it just more like a distortion of something that's very real to me.
Yeah. So it's like source material for you to kind of like rework and kind
Yes.
of
Yes.
This is
It's like a patio table that same thing. I just put it in parts, fired it with the porcelain, and then re-welded.
yeah. And then here we can see some of like the deconstruction, reconstruction.
This was the first painting that I did as the skin process. So it wasn't meant to be wrinkled. I actually, that night, it was a very long night between me and my only friend helping me.
Yeah.
And we had it all planned. We're gonna, you know, I finished the painting, they drying, I'm gonna scrape it, we're gonna collage it. And when we were doing a process of letting the skin of oil paint touch the adhesive,
Yeah.
the skin of paint swiped down in a aggressive manner, creating a wrinkle that I didn't expect it. But that accident really woke up the element of the paintings that I did later on.
Yeah. So it's as much a kind of like the act of collaging as it is of painting. Like
It is. It is both. It is.
Yeah.
It is. It's very physical, you know, and very. It has a certain element of, you know, the construction of the paintings and the process really carry a very emotional, psychological element to it.
Yeah. And what's interesting is like, so sorry, I'm going to just go back.
Yeah.
Like, so something like this, it's pretty obvious that like, you know, there's a lot of like work that's being done with the surface, and maybe less obvious with a painting like this, but even the figurative work is also, you know, involving this very laborious process.
You can see that the painting has this sort of gestural elements that you might see and notice later on the show that some people might look like, oh, it's broken, it's damaged, or that. It's just part of the process. And for me, what it does is that the process really doesn't let the people enter just fully into the imagery or book or looking for that narrative, but rather balance between how it's made and what is it about. So it stays a little bit on the surface.
Yeah. So like something like this, I mean, on the one hand, we can see like the gate and the grill work that, you know, like the iron work that we were talking about earlier. That's a very kind of clear reference to growing your house growing up, right? But then at the same time, there's like, so on that level, there's like memory work that's being done. But then there's also like the very literal process of like your painting is like layer upon layer. It's like a palimpsest or something, right? That it's like retaining the what had happened.
In
it.
And I think the layer, not just in a materialistic way, but also in terms of the subject matter. You can see the gate, and then you have this refrigerator with certain element, but then
with a chair.
With the chair. So, you know, I keep building it. I feel like this layers is what also makes the work more complex and more ambiguous in a positive way for me.
Yeah. And maybe at this point we can kind of, talk through the process because it's a little,
Yes, it's quite difficult sometimes to get, but this is actually a great picture to explain it because you see in the back there's these two plexiglasses where I have painted what you can probably recognize like a Picasso painting. So yeah, and then on top of that painting, I will make more paintings to reference to other artists or just me kind of working gestural. And when that dries, I bring those glass or plexiglass up to the floor, and with my knife, I start scraping the paint completely off.
Yeah.
So you can see the mirror-esque of what stays in the glass and what I'm able to take off and reveal, which is a very, very a distorted version of the original.
So maybe we can walk through like a few images of that.
Yeah.
So this is the scraping part, right?
Yes. You can see the effects of the blade, the oil paint. Obviously, parts of it are still wet, so it kind of gets very smushy. Some parts are actually really dry, so they don't come out.
And you call it a skin.
I call it skin because it's a connection towards a phrase I came across in school by William de Kooning, where he
Yeah.
says like oil paint. Flesh is the reason that oil paint was invented, and that always resonated to me because I felt that oil paint, being so connected to Earth,
Yeah.
and us as nature in general, I started calling it skins, and that's where it comes about.
Okay. And then so, like we've talked about de Kooning, and we've talked about Picasso, and there's actually one thing you revealed the other night was like there's actually a little Easter egg of a reference
Yes,
to Picasso in that painting. We can talk about that a little bit. But you also work with classical artists like
Yeah.
Poussin.
Yeah, I felt like when this is at an early moment within the process, I felt that it would have been really cool that it is very interesting to bring into the conversation of my unconventional method of painting.
Yeah.
A type of work that is considered a masterpiece that is painted, in such a traditional manner. So I kind of explored several other artists, but then I came across Nicolas Poussin.
Yeah.
And I don't know why the Poussin palette, the Poussin compositions,
Yeah.
really transformed in an abstract way, really interesting. So this is me working in my references to Nicolas Poussin, collapsing it with gestural painting and some other layers
Yeah.
to then later do the process.
So like just to be clear, you start off by basically making that painting.
Yes.
Like doing your version of that painting and then undoing it.
Yeah, undoing it pretty much, yes. Here you see that the Poussin, I have painted it, but then I started making these gestural lines. The yellow lines are actually me scraping out parts of the painting that I did days before. And then later I will cover it with who knows what colors back then.
And this is all on plexi.
These are still in the plexis, yes.
Yeah. And then
And that's the actual painting that we just saw, which pretty much disappears.
and at this point, this is like you having like scraped and done a lot of work on it.
Yeah, I have collaged it. I have scraped it, and then later I will collage it using also the technique of kind of folding it to create it even more abstract, but also more three-dimensional.
Yeah. This is a different stage.
As a small
Yeah.
painting.
And then so to get to a canvas like this or the ones on either side, then there's like multiple steps, right? And one of the things that I was noticing about them is that they're abstract, and normally when we talk about abstract painting, we think of it as simplification. We think like geometric abstraction is just like a triangle or a square or something like that. But the paintings that you make, they're abstract, but they're incredibly dense. Like they feel like they have a lot of cues of like just like what's going on in them, right? It's like it's not simple at all.
Yeah.
And so like I think, is it fair to say that it's part of the result of the process where you're kind of starting from something maybe that's there's cues like figurative, but then like as you're working through it, it's this accretion, like accumulation.
It is. I at a young age in my first visit to museums,
Yeah.
I still don't know why, I will say, but I was so attracted to painting that was the least flat possible.
Yeah.
So works that were abundant with a lot of paint or a lot of layers.
Yeah.
So I think even though, you don't see like an amount of paint in that matter, but there is layers and layers. And I think,
Like so thick.
yes. And I think it's just something that has stayed with me, and not just in the materiality,
Yeah.
but back again in the subject. So in these works, I take upon several artists. Like I said earlier, in this one, you see reference to de Kooning, you have etchings by Picasso, you have a Stuart Davis around. So I kind of do my own versions of these artists and these works, and then bringing it to my own language, my own abstraction.
Yeah. And here you can see a different painting, and so then like when you scrape, then what happens is also you literally scrape it off the plexi at some point, and it gets reversed.
Yeah, it's reversed. So if I want to paint a text, for example, say Angel, I have to paint it in reverse in order for Angel to come out correctly.
Okay.
If I just paint Angel, you can see in some little text here the word journal.
Yeah.
In some paintings, you can see it's kind of, mirror-esque
That one,
effect.
I think, right?
Yes.
There's a little bit of that. And downstairs, there's a painting. You can see the NAL from journal or newspaper, right?
Yeah, correct. So it comes out the other way around.
Yeah.
What is cool and complex about it is that I have to kind of paint in a memory kind of way, because I need to, make what I make first, and then I cover it. And then I have to keep reacting to what the things I have painted, but I'm not seeing them anymore.
So you're not peeking behind.
I'm not peeking behind.
Because I was like, oh, plexi, you could,
Yeah, sometimes I try to peek just to see, but no, mostly you just keep going. It's very intuitive, very organic. But I think the process, apart from, being very unique, of course, but it's really attached to as a metaphor towards memory. I really embrace memory, that matter, something very real that existed, that is with us. But when it comes for you to kind of visit it and transform it in some way, I feel there is a sort of blurriness, right? As we grow, that memory that we think is so perfectly in our head, when we try to make it physical, it takes a different shape, because we've changed in some way or the other. Yeah. So I like that about the process. It's very significant to me.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that maybe is, and here we can see some of the kind of more like...
Yeah, these were moments where I grew a bit of frustration about the canvas, about the process. I needed to step away from the boundaries of the square of the canvas. So I had a lot of paintings that I thought were not that good, but I never throw out nothing. So I'm very archival in that way. So I brought out all these old bad paintings, and I started cutting them out and making these compositions, and then kind of wiring together. So they are mounted in the wall almost like tapestries. So I left these negative spaces in some areas to make it more three-dimensional. But then at some point I started adding material like this lace and other stuff, just to kind of bring it again to the although it's an abstract and sculptural work, it also brings back the idea of these objects that I grew up with.
Yeah, back to life in some ways. Yeah.
So this one has like a little, from a chandelier. So it's just little moments, right, that are very intimate, almost secret, putting in the painting.
Yeah. Is that something that's very important to you, to kind of like bring it back to your everyday life?
You know what? It is, and I think, not because it's a continuation of my narrative, but I think in a personal matter, there's something that makes us feel protected, close to our loved ones or the things that we love. And by having that close to you, I don't know, there is something there that for me is quite magical and human, of course.
I mean, it's definitely very striking, because like in the middle of this very abstract work, right? There's this thing that is like...
Yeah, I wanted it to be that. I wanted it to be very intimate, almost like if you take something and you go to a little cave or by the beach and you're like, I need to put this here and leave it there. There's so many places in the world and cultures that do that for religious reasons, spiritual reasons, etc. And I like that, and I grew up around that as well.
Yeah. Has your have you had conversations with your family about your work?
I used to. I used to early on.
Yeah.
And in the beginning, it was very frustrating. They still don't see,
Yeah.
they don't see art in that kind of human matter.
Yeah.
They see it more as a craft.
Yeah.
But I have over time learned to speak to some extent,
Yeah.
but also embrace them how they are.
Yeah.
Because my work is about that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting for sure.
Yeah. And I guess now that it's because okay, so after Chicago, you moved to New York.
Yeah.
And you were, during the pandemic, you were first in Brooklyn, I think, right?
I was in Brooklyn, and during the pandemic, actually before the pandemic,
Uh-huh.
I really needed to get away from the city.
Yeah.
New York is an incredible place, but being in the city, sometimes for some people, can get overwhelming, specifically creative people, and there is moments where you need that kind of peace or solitary. And so I went to upstate New York,
Yeah.
and I found this space that I fell in love with the moment
Yeah.
I saw it, which is an old church.
Yeah.
So I spent the pandemic there most of the time.
But now you're in the process of relocating to Puerto Rico.
I moved back to Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Yes. I felt that for so many years I've been making work that has to do not about me, but in general also about my island and speaking so much about it. And I feel like, time goes so quickly, or at least it feels like that. And I'm really aiming to see what can I make, being physically in the island
Yeah.
and being close to my family, people, but also the art community there.
Yeah.
So I've been going back and forth between Puerto Rico and New York. Yes.
So it's like less the memory of the place than you're going to be
there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think at this point I'm quite curious to see, how the work develops with that.
And so, we started with pictures from the show in New York, and we're back there.
Yeah, that's a great picture.
Yeah. And then we have the paintings here and also the audience here. I think we've talked for a good while, and I was wondering if maybe we can open up to the Q&A from the audience.
Yeah. Yeah, I work on them at the same time, and I will admit early on, it was kind of difficult to feel comfortable with that. I thought, at least I had grown right out of school and all that I needed to focus on one thing, either abstract or figurative. But when I'm working in the figurative paintings, for example, they are very intimate. They're very emotional and very in a different way. And kind of I compare it a little bit like going home and visiting mom and dad and others, and I miss them. I love them, and I go there. But it comes a moment where I need to get out of the house and take a break, and I go to this other place, and I involve myself there, and then I have the need to go back. And there is a gain to that for me balances my way of working in the studio. So I do work with them simultaneously. Yeah.
And one thing I guess maybe is that even with the abstract work, at some point there's some figuration involved in it. Or
Yeah. Or the other way around, or the figurative works, I want to find a way of making them more abstract, and the abstractions, I want to kind of bring a figurative element to it. So I think there is a dancing between the two.
Yeah. Other questions? Oh.
The first work there. Oh, well, actually, yeah, I forgot about that. So I made this painting in my first year, or end of first year of grad school. I was in that moment of kind of exploring what I should paint.
Yeah.
I hadn't yet paint, personal things. But in the library, which I spent a lot of time at, I came across this book of a place called, please tell me if I pronounce the word, Kowloon.
Yeah.
Kowloon. And it's this image of this city, and it looks like a cube, like a square in the photo. And I was so curious about it because it felt quite abstract too, although it's something so real and specific. So within my research to it, I went back to the studio and I started repainting it in abstract matter, my version of Kowloon.
Yeah.
And and eventually the school was asked to participate in a art fair
Yeah.
created by Susan Getz, who you know, and it was to promote the MFA programs. It was School of the Art Institute, Yale, Hunter, UCLA, so on. So I won kind of the competition, and they selected my work to be exhibited in the art fair. It wasn't for sale. It wasn't a commercial space. But out of my excitement on a Saturday, I went to the fair, and I wanted to be close to my painting or ish to see what people are saying, how people are reacting. I don't know. And that's when a security guard, old lady,
Yeah.
approached me, saying, "Oh, you like that painting?" And I'm like, "Yeah, actually, I'm the one who painted it." She's like, "Really?" So she takes her hand, puts it on her pocket, and she pulls out all these business cards. She's like, "All these people are asking me to give you these cards because I think they want to buy your painting." So I went back to school, super excited. I started emailing all these business cards.
Yeah.
And be like, "Hey, I'm Angel Otero. I'm the one who painted it." That was the first painting I sold, and it's in some ways it opened me my first group exhibitions, and then solo, and from so on, so on.
Yeah. And so, I mean, even though, it was maybe a little bit of a rough landing when you first got to Chicago because, you had never left Puerto Rico before and you're like all of a sudden in this new place. And it turned out to actually have been a very hospitable place, like in the end, or nurturing, like in some ways.
Yeah, it really was, and I think also the fact that I was so alone, meaning like there was no family. This was the early beginnings of Facebook.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. So it's not like on the internet we have that kind of connections.
Yeah.
It gave me a certain sense of freedom to explore not just my artwork but myself too. I had to learn to cook, which now I love doing. I had to learn how to wash my clothes because my grandma used to love washing my clothes. So there was a learning experience of independence.
Yeah.
And being responsible in many aspects. So it really, being in Chicago, transformed a lot of those elements to me, which I'm very appreciative about.
Yeah. And now you're the cook in your household.
I love cooking. I really do.
Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Grandma, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure. I think there's several parts to that. I definitely, at a young age, like I said, grew up in front of the ocean. So looking at the ocean every day stayed with me in many ways. But there's a particular kind of memories that I have that has to do with water. And these are things that I still can't really understand why they stayed with me. But a very specific one, and I will say it's one of my earliest memories, was as a kid, I would sleep. It was such a small house. I slept in my grandma's bed with her. And one day I wake up to these raindrops inside the room. And I thought it's raining in here, but it's raining inside the room. Because I couldn't understand that there was a water leak from my neighbor or something. And the reactions to that is you're surprised, but the the sense of not understanding something, but it still feels kind of cool and magical. I bring it, and obviously, in this part of my life and older, the more I think about it, the more I kind of bring it in the word. Because not because to tell the story, right? Because I don't speak about it too much, but I use it as my own tool, like this own little intimate moment that is very poetic, and I think it was fun and cool. So the water has been present not just because of the ocean, but because of memories like that, certain games, and so I often say like making art not always is about kind of saying, but sometimes it's about questioning too, and leaving us things as question. It's okay also, not having an answer to things, and I like that the water, the fluidity of water, the complexity, and the ambiguous of it can represent that too. Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's the same way I felt when I'm making that word. I did the abstract paintings, right? And I felt they were lacking content. They were ambitious, they were monumental, and I just couldn't tell what was missing on it. And then I tend to buy a lot of like stuff and antiques and just all sort of weird things. And so I had these glasses that I bought in an antique shop, and I put it there. And I had actually a friend visit me once, a curator from Boston, and then she arrived in the studio like, "Hey, how you doing?" And I'm like, "Looking at the new work," and she's like, "Oh, you're going back to your old works, like about home." And I felt like, wow, that's interesting. So I really want it to be something, and I think it's a little more or less what you're saying, like that people can, yes, think about painting, think about a sculptural way of painting, but then have this moment which kind of create a more kind of complex dialogue between the materials or the meaning of the work. And that's when I really started adding these objects. Yeah.
yeah. And so, I mean, one thing that, following up on that, I mean, like you've talked about the objects as being kind of like trampolines that allow you to like kind of dive into the act of painting. Are these kind of like trampolines or kind of like path, like entry points for the viewer to kind of get into the work
I
too?
think there's more like entry points. I think
Yeah.
you're right. I think
Yeah.
they definitely feel more like that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I it definitely, I'm sure it does. I don't think it's something in my creative process, in my creative thinking. I don't think I read the news every morning. I'm aware of everything, but I don't think I go directly like, okay, I'm gonna go here to paint about this. I think I try to be more organic and knowing that even though I read that or I'm aware of certain things happening, they are with me. And I know they're going to translate in the work somewhere in the other. I speak about the paintings being about my home, about my grandmother, but they're really about Puerto Rico. They're about the culture in the island, the society in the island, the social aspect, the political aspect, not necessarily directly, right? But they are present, and it took me a while to understand that. But I believe and embrace really that's the way how I approach them, for sure. That's a really cool question. Thanks.
Yeah. Here.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think I mostly use that word in different ways, not just gestural, like gestural painting, but I did grew up, my first kind of in love moment with art was with the abstract expressionist works, right? And I kept reading like, oh, gestural, and gestural can be so emotional. It's about the emotion and the movement. So I think I imply that word also these days towards the way that I approach my subjects, the way I imply my subjects too. I think, the framing of it is around those different angles, for sure.
Okay. If there's any urgent last questions, otherwise I think we're getting. Oh, one last question.
Hey, for now, I'm gonna go back and forth because it's not that easy to kind of break my routine, and then it hasn't been that easy to kind of feel in complete kind of uh, peace of mind in the island to kind of work without being in New York. So it's gonna be very what's the word, gradual?
Yeah.
Very gradual. And I like to have New York close to me as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the process. But really, it was an idea of I felt, I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about time and how we relate to time, and I've really been curious to see like what can happen if I'm back at home, right? After so many years and making art at home and being even closer to my upbringing, my family, my friends, the culture of my island. And I want to see how that really evolves in the work. Either I embrace it more or it might even be more challenging. I don't know, but I'm in that process right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up here. And thank you so much, Angel. That was fantastic.